The session that we are sharing now is a session on anti-Semitism during the Holocaust. And our first presenter is Jules RIEGEL from Harvard University, where she is a lecturer. And Jules will speak about Jewish musicians in Treblinka. And I'm handing over the microphone for Jules.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to talk about this today. As a little bit of a preface, this is a new area for me to work on, not actually geographically that far from what I work on normally, which is the Warsaw Ghetto. This is relatively new. It's under development. This paper went through many different forms on the way to what you're going to hear today. The title at the moment is Redemption for Whom? Musical Anti-Semitism and Jewish Musicians in Treblinka, 1942 to 43. But I'm very much looking forward to your feedback on this. So the paper today, I want to investigate musical performances in the death camp Treblinka between its opening in July 1942 to the prisoner revolt in August of 1943. And despite the camp's deadly purpose, music, as it turns out, was actually present nearly everywhere, accompanying mass murder and punctuating the abject lives of the prisoners who were actually responsible for many of the camp's daily operations. Now, much of this music was produced under duress, and some musical performances were, of course, straightforwardly torture, while other music actually was, as far as I can tell, voluntarily performed by prisoners for one another in their scraps of free time and in whatever passed for privacy. And I'm initially seeking to approach this music through Saul Friedlander's concept of redemptive anti-Semitism. In his authoritative account of the Holocaust, Nazi Germany, and the Jews, Friedlander identified the specifically German form of racial anti-Semitism. Rather than drawing on simply just race science, this form of racial anti-Semitism has distinctly religious, mystical tones. He writes, born of the fear of racial degeneration and the religious belief in redemption. So the ideologues who espoused this form of anti-Semitism believed that Germany was doomed unless it engaged Jews in, again, he called it a struggle to the death. He writes, redemption would come as liberation from the Jews, as their expulsion, possibly their annihilation. So by removing Jews from the body of the German nation and eventually from the European continent beyond, the Nazis and their ideological forebears believed that they would redeem Germany and the world in this very mystical sense. Now, Friedlander located redemptive anti-Semitism's origins in Richard Wagner's Bayreuth Circle, although not necessarily in Wagner himself as a person, whose own anti-Semitism he characterized as both undeniable and also kind of inconsistent. Setting aside, though, for the moment, the vigorous scholarly debate on Wagner's own anti-Semitism, the Bayreuth Circle's important role in the emergence of redemptive anti-Semitism, I think, helps indicate for us, music's prominence in Nazi ideology, and we've already heard a bit about that today. Music was, of course, subject to intense political scrutiny in Nazi Germany. As Lily Hirsch, among others, have convincingly argued, music was so intensely politicized that any performance really was a political act, regardless of the context or of the performer's intentions. Music, of course, like every other field of life, was subject to Gleichschaltung, or coordination, under Nazi ideology. This meant purging both Jews and their music from German musical culture in order, again, to redeem the latter. This was not an easy task, complicated primarily, of course, by the difficulties of actually defining Jewish or indeed German music, as well as Nazi infighting and actually the widespread popularity of many Jewish composers' music. Nonetheless, the Nazi Party and state exerted a lot of effort to eliminate what they saw as Jewish influence from music, believing that this was key to their mission to redeem Germany. So as I hope to show today, musical life in Treblinka, turning to that, it resists easy simplification. And Friedlander's model of redemptive anti-Semitism is both affirmed and challenged by its realities. Friedlander's concept, of course, is a persuasive one. I think it's in many ways the most robust model of anti-Semitism, Nazi anti-Semitism we have. But by examining music in Treblinka, we come up against its limits, as I'll show through analysis of 3 testimonies. The Aktion Reinhard camps, which included Treblinka, were, I argue, meant as laboratories of Nazi anti-Semitism, where their redemptive goals would reach apotheosis. And yet, in music, the impulse toward the purification of the German racial body that Friedlander perceptively identified remained curiously flawed and incomplete. Particularly striking given that Treblinka was otherwise arguably the most undiluted expression of Nazi anti-Semitism. Hundreds or perhaps thousands of Jewish musicians perished within its gas chambers, purging them indeed from the body of European music. And yet simultaneously, music temporarily spared the lives of multiple prisoners, at least one of whom actually survived. Crucially at Treblinka, the SS and their Ukrainian collaborators repeatedly chose to listen to unambiguously Jewish music. The prisoner musicians' repertoire included what survivors repeatedly described as Jiddische Stichlech, or little Jewish pieces of music, as well as prayers and cantorial music, and actually a great deal of popular interwar music, much of which was written by Jewish composers. In fact, in many ways, Treblinka's commanders and guards promoted or valued certain elements of Jewish musical culture, even as they sought to annihilate it. So to offer a little brief historical background first, of the three Aktion Reinhard death camps where occupied Poland's Jews most of them were murdered, Treblinka was the last built and the most lethal. It was constructed in a thinly settled area near the Bug River, about 100 kilometers northeast of Warsaw. And it would become, in many ways, the most perfected camp of this operation. Its construction and operation benefited from the expertise developed at Belzec and Sobibor, the previous two Reinhard camps, as well as the Aktion T4 killings of disabled Germans. Treblinka was divided into three main parts, which you can see a little bit on the map up here. There is the reception area where transports arrived. That's kind of in the center, lower center. There's Camp 1, or often called the lower camp, labeled here as the living area, where most camp personnel lived. And then Camp 2, or the upper camp, labeled here as the extermination area, which held the gas chambers, burial pits, and quarters for the Sonderkommando prisoners who removed bodies from the gas chambers and buried or burned them. The camp operated between July 1942 and October 1943. In that time, between 700 and 950,000 Jews were murdered there, in addition to around 2,000 Romani. So music at Treblinka, though, took a wide variety of forms, but it's received relatively little scholarly attention. Accounts of the camp typically dedicate no more than a few pages to sort of broadly characterizing musical activities in the camp. Jacob Flaus's recent book, Spaces of Treblinka, is sort of symptomatic of this. He addresses music only briefly as part of a larger discussion, which is otherwise quite excellent, of the camp's sensory environment. Scholars like Katarzyna Nalewajek-Mazurek have argued that music functioned primarily as a form of torture. And similarly, Alexandra Birch has argued in her recent book that music was part of a sadistic and violent total sound environment, one that she writes emphasized genocidal othering of victims and reinforced the camp's brutal hierarchies. In another field, Aaron McLaughlin has sensitively considered how to analyze perpetrator and survivor testimonies side by side through the case study of performances of Treblinka's camp anthem by former SS guard Franz Suchomel in Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, and by survivors Samuel Willenberg and Kalman Teigman. But none of these authors actually addressed the specifically Jewish dimensions of the music performed at Treblinka. And through this omission, these accounts risk oversimplifying the nature and phenomenology of music at Treblinka, flattening out what careful, close reading reveals to be prisoners' remarkably nuanced and complex choices, albeit, of course, ones made under significant duress, and their strategies for compliance, resistance, and survival, even if those strategies did not ultimately change their fate. So, turning to my first case study, Abram Jakub Szepicki, pictured on the left here. On August 25th of 1942, Abram Jakub Szepicki was deported from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka. He was about 25 years old. As a young, physically capable man, he was initially chosen for a work detail, so he was not immediately gassed on arrival. And remarkably, after about 2 weeks, he managed to escape and actually returned to Warsaw and to the ghetto. There, he gave testimony to Rachel Euerbach, pictured here on the right, a member of the ghetto's clandestine archive, on what he'd seen. And the testimony is like hundreds of pages long and really remarkable. Music first appears in his testimony amidst a discussion of Treblinka's strategies of deception, employed to prevent the very large numbers of people who arrived from revolting against the much smaller group of guards and officers. Upon arrival, as is well known, victims saw all the trappings of a small-town railway station, including a ticket office, a waiting room, and flower beds, all meant to maintain the ruse for as long as possible that this was no more than an innocuous transit camp. At the same time, this deception was accompanied by violence at strategic moments, shouts, whippings, blows from rifle butts, to drive people along the so-called Schlauch, or tube, on the way to the gas chambers. It was on this path that Skrzypicki first encountered music in Treblinka, he told Auerbach. And I'm going to read here from his testimony. For a long time, it had seemed to me that I heard music. I thought it was a radio installed here by the Germans, which was supposed to protect them in this godforsaken pit from being cut off, God forbid, from the culture of their fatherland. Now I had the opportunity to see that their concern for musical culture was still greater. Near the path along which Jews were driven to the showers, a small orchestral band stood beneath a tree. 3 players from Stoczek stood there and played their instruments. What interested me most was a long trumpet, some kind of little pipe or flute. Besides that, there was a violin and a mandolin. The musicians stood and scraped away with enthusiasm. It was hard to find your bearings in their repertoire. They were probably playing some of the latest hits, the favorite pieces of the Germans and Ukrainians. They also often ordered them to play during carousing in the guardhouses. So there's a lot going on here. And I want to point to several important themes from this passage. First, of course, is the Germans' concern for musical culture and need for connection to that culture. Now, obviously, Skrzypicki is being somewhat mocking here, but he's identifying a real phenomenon, and he obliquely noted this German affinity for music in a passage that immediately follows this previous one, where he says, "A friend from Krakow told me about an unbelievable idiocy that he once heard from a high German official. We are the leading nation in the field of deportation," this official told him with all seriousness, and probably at that time it seemed to him that what he said really made sense, that deportation is a kind of new branch of human activity, a kind of new branch of production. German music, German philosophy, and German deportations. So beyond this connection between music and Germanness, there is also a more mundane explanation. Treblinka was an isolated and highly secretive site. Unlike SS members working in the concentration camp system inside Germany, or even at larger camps like Auschwitz, the Germans present at Treblinka had few links with the outside world, relatively speaking, and relatively little access to entertainment. They were mostly young men in their late 20s. Many had wives and children, but saw them only rarely. And this isolation and real boredom likely played a role in their actions. This is not to say, oh, poor SS, but I think it helps explain a bit what they were doing. Auerbach wrote after the war, in fact, that the SS in Treblinka created ensembles like this one, quote, to provide a little color to the monotony of the murder workshop, and, quote, to create musical pleasure, in addition to drowning out the sounds of mass murder. Now, testimony, including Skrzypicki's, actually indicates that while music was sometimes played as transports arrived, it was ineffective at covering up shouts, screams, and gunshots. So this really leaves us with the first motivation of musical pleasure. Yet, Skrzypicki's description of the prisoner musicians' repertoire, instruments, and musical style strongly suggests that they were not playing works of high German musical Kultur, but rather possibly traditional klezmer, most likely wedding music, and perhaps in addition to the latest hits, schlagers. The clearest evidence for this is Skrzypicki's word choice. He called the musicians klezmorim in Yiddish, not musiker or another more all-purpose term. Moreover, these were small-town musicians from Stoczek, he says. And while there are several settlements in Poland with this name, Skrzypicki most likely meant a village about 20 kilometers from Treblinka. Jewish men from this Stoczek Węgrowski, were among the forced laborers who built Treblinka, and its remaining Jewish population was deported to the death camp around the same time that Skrzypicki arrived. Of the few references to music in Stoczek's Jezkorbuch, most actually concern klezmorim at weddings. Taken together, I think these facts strongly suggest that these were, at least by background, traditional Jewish instrumentalists who would have performed before the war at Jewish and Gentile weddings and perhaps in taverns. So this suggestion that their music was potentially distinctly Jewish in character is borne out by the next scene in Skrzypicki's testimony. On the 3rd anniversary of the war's beginning, he told Auerbach, and I quote again from his testimony, "The SS arranged a party with music for the Jews. They brought the musicians, again, klezmorim, to the Appellplatz, or assembly, like the assembly yard, essentially, and it ordered them to play Jewish pieces, Yiddische Stücklech. A pair of young Jews were ordered to step forward and dance. An older Ukrainian corporal directed the show. The Germans were wildly pleased, applauded, and doubled over with laughter. Now, this is particularly interesting to me because Krzepicki's description of this particular forced performance bears substantial similarities to the Polish phenomenon of mayufis. This term originally derived from the Hebrew Sabbath zemer mayefit, or in Ashkenazi pronunciation, mayofis, refers to Jews performing quasi-ritualized and stereotyped songs and dances for a heckling Polish audience. These performances were often humiliating and sometimes turned violent. The older Ukrainian corporal fits this pattern as well. Mayufis occurred across Polish lands, including Western Ukraine, where the Travniki men who became guards at Treblinka were recruited. From the order to play Jewish pieces to the forced dancing and the SS's laughter, it's not difficult to read this episode as an example of mayufis. It's sort of a textbook example, in fact. Yet it again potentially represents an instance when the SS was deliberately choosing to listen to Jewish music, albeit as a sort of weapon of humiliation. As Brett Werb has demonstrated, while mayufis was typically indeed a form of humiliation, the music associated with it tells a more nuanced story, since much of it was actually composed by Jews, and in some cases may have been performed by Jews for willing Jewish audiences, in this kind of complicated history of how it came into Polish theater. In some cases, these audiences would include acculturated city dwellers who were there to mock small-town Hasidim, essentially. So there's a lot going on here. These performances for the SS personnel and their Ukrainian auxiliaries, though, I think help exemplify the tension of applying redemptive anti-Semitism to music at Treblinka. Many writers, including survivors, post-war witnesses, and later scholars, have argued that the SS at Treblinka believed themselves to be fulfilling a special and morally righteous historical mission. Vasily Grossman, for instance, reported that the SS would deliver speeches to the doomed in which they explained at length how their race was superior to all other races. They delivered tirades about German blood, the German character, and the mission of the German race. These speeches fit neatly into Friedlander's framework of a mystical redemptive form of anti-Semitism, and the same could be said broadly for Krzepicki's emphasis on the SS's concern for musical culture. Yet the specific music that the SS enjoyed was often far from the Aryan ideals of Wagner's Bayreuth Circle, suggesting that redemptive anti-Semitism can't fully explain what's going on here. Turning to my second case study, Jerzy Rajgrodzki. So this is a really fascinating one to me. He's the only prisoner musician I know of who survived the war at Treblinka. And his testimony, therefore, offers us a pretty unique perspective on music in the camp. I can't cover it all today because of time, but his account emphasizes that music in the camp was not merely a form of torment and humiliation. While it's, of course, very difficult to speak of genuine prisoner agency in this kind of context, Rajgrodzki's testimony does show ways in which prisoners took initiative in organizing the camp's musical activities. And it offers another glimpse of specifically Jewish music. Rajgrodzki worked in Camp 2, in the death camp, initially carrying corpses from the gas chambers to the burial pits. I'm also going to just put this up here for you guys to look at. I'm going to come back to it in a moment. Though he was not a professional musician, he'd studied violin at a conservatory, and a capo soon recruited him to play alongside Fuchs, a clarinetist from Polskie Radio, while his fellow prisoners worked. When not performing, he was assigned to work in the kitchens, which was a desirable position with access to shelter and more access to food. Out of an apparent sense of competition with the much larger prisoner ensemble in Camp 1, which was led by the famous Varsovian violinist Artur Gold, an Oberkapo, another prisoner functionary, successfully intervened with the SS to rescue an accordionist, Abraham Melodista, from a transport. Melodista, a skilled performer and composer of popular interwar dance music, joined the other two to form a trio, which performed at daily roll calls. One of the things they performed, according to Rajgrodzki, was this little tune here, Lager 2 ist unser Leben, ai, ai, ai. This was Camp 2's camp hymn, pictured on this slide. Incidentally, if anyone has any thoughts on the tune, please let me know at some point. It was apparently, according to Rajgrodzki, an original composition by a dentist in the camp, probably not actually a trained dentist. I haven't been able to learn anything else about it, and I'm trying to figure out what to do with it. This trio that formed in Camp 2 also played for individual SS members and Ukrainian auxiliaries upon request, often receiving chocolate, cigarettes, and even from the Ukrainians, newspapers in return, which is really quite remarkable. Raygotsky also related this remarkable description of a wedding that took place in Camp 2. He writes, "There was another engaged couple. The young man was a mechanic for the gassing engines, and his fiancée was a middling girl." Hurtful. They were given a grand wedding ceremony according to all the prescriptions of the Jewish faith. Even a few SS men came. At that time, there was already some talk about preparing the uprising, but even so, everything happened peacefully. We played at this wedding, and the young couple were led to the chuppah. There was someone who could write the Tanoim and say the prayers. The young couple were even allowed to spend the night together in Camp 2's kitchen. This is not, of course, the only account of a wedding taking place in Treblinka. Survivor Richard Glaser wrote in his memoirs of a wedding between a prisoner informant and a young woman that was arranged by the notoriously sadistic Deputy Camp Commandant Kurt Franz. But Glaser specified that this wedding included, quote, no pomp, no religious ceremony, no band. Very different from the account that we get here, which suggests, once again, potentially a space for some Jewish music at Treblinka. Now, given these musicians' specific professional backgrounds, it's less clear than in Krzepicki's account that they would have played traditional klezmer tunes. These were not village klezmorim, but urban and professionally trained musicians. Perhaps most importantly, I think Raygotsky's testimony suggests a little bit of space for prisoner agency in music. And approaching all music in Treblinka as torment means that we necessarily overlook the complexities present in cases like this. For my final case study, I want to talk about someone named Meyer Capo and return for a moment to Rachel Auerbach, who recorded Krzepicki's account. She survived the war in hiding, and in 1947 she published a book, Auf die Felder von Treblinka, which is this journalistic report on the camp combined with these haunting literary reflections on loss. In it, she reports her conversations with a survivor named Tanchum, who told her about a young prisoner the others called Meyer Capo, in deference to his status as a prisoner functionary. Meyer was a religious Jew, Tanchum said, with a very beautiful singing voice. And at the end of each day in the barracks, he prayed the evening prayers, recited El Malay Rachamim, one of the Jewish prayers for the dead, and led the other prisoners in the Kaddish. When Auerbach asked Tanchum how the Germans and Ukrainians reacted, he responded, quote, "What a state of affairs. You apparently don't know about the music in Treblinka." What a question, if I know, she says as an aside. You don't know that the Germans liked little Jewish songs, again, Yiddische Sticklich. They used to come listen under the windows. Until he, that is Meyer, was shot, he was respected among them, a capo, though he never did anything bad to us. And Auerbach was understandably struck by this image, Treblinka's murderers listening to a prayer for the Jewish dead they had killed. This passage is particularly intriguing, and now I'm going to be, I think, the third person to talk about Ruth Cohen today, when considered alongside her analysis of the synagogal soundscape as this source of disturbing noise for early 20th century Gentile Europeans, giving rise to the Viennese saying, ein Lärm wie in einer Judenschule, or a tumult like in a synagogue, right? There's no din or chaos in Tanchum's account. In contrast to most survivors' testimonies, which typically emphasize Treblinka's inescapably violent soundscape, the camp seems almost still, its functionaries' attention captured by young Meyer's voice. If anything, his prayer establishes the quiet grief conveyed in Auerbach's final words on Meyer. And not far away is a forest, and around it is a field of the dead. And finally, again, Tanchum used the same phrase as Krzepicki, Yiddische Sticklich, when describing the SS's apparent enjoyment of the music in question. That this music was explicitly Jewish is undeniable, and as with the previous examples, it has, I think, the potential to complicate our understanding of Treblinka's musical environment. To conclude briefly, this is, of course, only a very partial picture of Treblinka's musical landscape. To analyze it fully is far beyond the scope of this paper, as I found out very rapidly while trying to write it. But as Krzepicki and Raygotsky's testimonies and Auerbach's reported show, in Treblinka, German music's redemption from alleged Jewish influence was far from complete, even when that Jewish music was weaponized as a form of humiliation. And none of this, of course, is to suggest that music had any real power to redeem the prisoners. Most perished, including nearly all the camp's musicians. But this music need not have had a concrete effect on survival for it to be a significant part of Treblinka's history and its soundscape. Above all, I think these examples reveal a tension in perhaps the most robust theory of Nazi anti-Semitism, or at the very least, a significant gap between theory and practice. In Treblinka, where we might expect to find music solely as an extension of Nazi racial ideologies, the story that emerges from these accounts is significantly more complex. Thank you.
Question for Jules. I'm happy to come around with a microphone. Well, while you gather your thoughts, thank you so much for bringing Treblinka, putting it on the map for us, because I think that Treblinka is not being talked about very much in musicological contexts. And your study is rather interdisciplinary, and I'd like to kind of circle back to maybe a more kind of musical angle here, and really just pose the rudimentary question: if you have to place Treblinka and your study into kind of the longue durée of music and anti-Semitism, what kind of specific mark would it make, and how could we actually place it into the longue durée, and what distinguishes it from papers that we have heard before? How do you see its specific significance?
It's a big question.
It's a big question, I'm sorry.
Okay. No, it's
After lunch, a lot to digest.
It's a very good question. I'm gonna make my best attempt. I may have to follow up on this more later. So in terms of how I'd place it in the longue durée, I mean, there is a lot here that, to me, is actually somewhat familiar. My work on the Warsaw Ghetto, I deal a lot with the way that sort of pre-war conceptions, and of course there's a sort of smaller longue durée I'm thinking about right now, but pre-war conceptions of music, and even sort of 19th century and 18th century conceptions of music are still enduring in terms of how people think about music and what its function should be, right? And I do think we see those continuing in Treblinka in certain ways, in the ways that music becomes a marker of identity, perhaps, or can serve as that. Boy, this is a difficult question. At the same time, I think that, you know, I do see some connections to some of the papers from this morning as well, when we're thinking about the ways that Jews have responded to these anti-Semitic discourses in music with their own music, as it were. That this has never been a sort of one-directional story of, you know, it all just coming from anti-Semites against Jews, as it were, but that there's always been, like, to some degree, some amount of pushback, some amount of you know, I don't like using the word resistance. I don't think it does anything really analytically, but that in essence, you know, that there is agency running in both directions, I guess I would say.
I think that, and this also already kind of, I think, preempts questions for the next paper. I think that that the Holocaust itself is a framework that people have used as a terrain to kind of filter in musical questions, but have not really related it directly to typologies of anti-Semitism, which you have done very beautifully with redemptive anti-Semitism. So with typology and with specific processes, rather than looking at the larger container and the context. And so I think that, you know, you both actually pose us with a challenge in a way. How can we, where do we draw the line, and how do we approach music during the Holocaust through the angle, very specifically, very directly, anti-Semitism, and what kind of typology are we going to apply? So that's kind of, I think, more of a challenge that we might think, because we naturally think of the Holocaust as being inherently anti-Semitic, but yet, you know, there are distinctions between Holocaust and anti-Semitism per se.
Right, and if I could respond to that briefly, I think this is for me very much coming from my training as a historian, that I want to attend to historical context and the very concrete specificities of it. And I think this is one of those cases where, again, we don't find what we expect, and that is exactly why it's important to really attend to the details that are found in the sources, and to, it's not that the sources speak for themselves, but to actually really attend to what they are saying and what things they might be saying that are unexpected. I think it's really easy to say that music at Treblinka is torture, and it was, but I don't think that's the whole story. And I think that is a key component of what I'm trying to do here is really attend to these details that might otherwise be missed. Thank you.
I could hijack the whole Q&A. Before I do that, let me hand over the microphone to a participant who wants to ask a question.
I was just curious, as you're talking about the historical context here, if you looked at today's world, what's the modern day musical answer or context that we could bring into whether some of the entertainers who might stand up in terms of what they could create to answer the rising anti-Semitism of today? Is there a musical context for that you could recommend or look from a historical perspective that may impact on what we're facing now?
So sorry, if I understand your question, you're asking essentially, given the context of anti-Semitism today in 2025, are there sort of musicians or creators who are responding to that in a similar way?
Or it could be based on history. From history, you can look to the future. As a historian, could you look to the future and recommend what could be done to some of the musicians or composers today to counter what's going on now from your historical context?
I mean, there's few things historians like less than trying to predict the future. But, I think that one of the things I often come back to is that people remain people in whatever circumstances they're in. And they'll often engage in remarkable acts of creativity, even in sort of like the grimmest environment. And I think that can be, I'm very cautious of sort of like easy triumph of the human spirit, like narratives, because I don't think that's actually really fair to the sort of things I've studied. That I think is too comforting. And yet at the same time, I don't want to ignore or overlook or erase the very real, remarkable things that people do. And so it's cheesy, but pay attention to human beings. That's the best advice I have.
Jules, thank you so much. This was fascinating. I've had the pleasure of reading some of your work on Warsaw, so I have a little bit of an insider knowledge of some of the other stuff you've looked at. But I'm wondering, I know in some of your other work you look at intergenerational stuff and this idea of like children and young adults, and I'm wondering if, as you're now starting to unpack this Treblinka story, if you're seeing or you're able to parse out any of this sort of like generational, either intergenerational stuff that's happening there or flattening of generations that might happen when everybody's sort of put in the same context. I'm not really sure, but I think you parsed that out so well, and I'm curious to know if you've seen anything yet.
Boy, yeah, that is another really tricky question. So off the top of my head, I do know of a couple of cases of people who are described as very young, like maybe 14 or so, who are musicians, Märker being one of them. There's also an accordionist named, all we know about him is his name was Edek, right? So there were young musicians, at least temporarily present. I think that the phrase you used, a flattening of generations, I think is maybe the most apt one. In a sense, this is, there's this sort of, these pressures during the Holocaust on Jewish children that forced them to grow up very, very quickly. I think in sort of a very meaningful way, they were no longer able to be children. And certainly that would be true in this context. There are accounts from other prisoners that suggest that, they're of course aware of the age differences, but, and perhaps at certain moments protective of younger prisoners, but there just aren't very many of them, and they're all in this same environment. So it'd be hard to speak of a specific generational dynamic that way. In terms of the music itself, I think there might be a really interesting question to dig into in terms of what is actually being performed. And that is still a question I'm trying to develop the answer to. I'm trying to like actually assemble a list of stuff that I know was performed there, and it's pretty incomplete thus far. Yeah, I'll leave it at that, but maybe we could follow up on this more, yeah.
So, one more question about Mackenzie.
Thank you, Jules. This is really fascinating material, and I really appreciate the nuance that you bring to this really complicated and difficult place. My question is a little bit about what you just mentioned, which is the repertoire for these. Obviously, this is an extremely deadly extermination camp, so one imagines that a repertoire is lost. At the same time, I was really struck by the dentist song that you put up there, which is notated in the testimony, clearly remembered as a song and as a text. So I suppose the question is, did songs specifically from Treblinka emerge in the post-war efforts to collect and to document the song cultures of the camps in early post-war Poland?
Yeah, I suppose I was kind of wondering if anyone would ask about this, because if you've seen Shoah, which probably many of us have, there is in fact a song from Treblinka in Shoah, which is the Treblinka lied or Treblinka song that Franz Suchomel sings for Landsmann. So there are a few songs that we do know that survived. There's that one, which isn't in here mainly for reasons of space, and this one as well, which I don't think anyone has written about. I might be mistaken on that, but in terms of other repertoire, I know that they were playing, I mean, I've got sources that say they were playing German march songs in some cases. You know, the term Schlager could encompass a lot of stuff. Polish patriotic military marches, like My Pierwsza Brigada was performed. There was a foxtrot from a 1934 Soviet musical comedy called Jolly Fellows that was performed. Really bizarre. It's kind of this interesting mix, right? And then at the same time, you have like Amal Rachamim, you have Eli Eli being performed, like, and these are things that the prisoners are mostly performing for one another, as sort of an expression of grief and a sort of reaching for something, a way to deal with what they're witnessing, right? That interestingly, some of them reject entirely, and are actually really outraged that anyone would be praying or reciting these prayers, right? So there's a pretty big range, I would say, in terms of the repertoire, and I know some of it, right? I can say that much right now, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, let me go.
Thank you. I wonder if your work in Warsaw is at all related to the work here in terms of the musicians or the music that was made in both places. Whether we may have very little information from Treblinka, but you may have come across more in Warsaw. And a more general question. You used the term Jewish music several times, and I wonder whether your work on the what you call the Jewish music in Treblinka was affected by, your definition was affected by your research.
Yeah, those are both great questions. So yes, there are connections. I actually originally came to this while working on my research. I came to this this idea essentially that became this paper maybe 8 years ago while doing research for my dissertation, which is now the book project, on music in the Warsaw Ghetto, where I came across a reference to a singer in the Warsaw Ghetto who, again, didn't make it into this today for reasons of space, who I know performed in the Warsaw Ghetto. I actually know a fair amount about his performances there. And then I have a handful of references to his performances in Treblinka, and I know that he survived initial selection because prisoners, like forced laborers in Treblinka from Warsaw, recognized him, identified him as a musician, a skilled musician, and essentially pleaded his case with the SS and said, look, don't you want him to perform for you? And that was what saved him from being sent to the gas chambers upon arrival. And that sort of sparked my interest in trying to explore what was going on musically in Treblinka. So there are absolutely connections. Artur Gold, who I mentioned very briefly, was very, very well-known musician and composer, in interwar Poland. He was also in the Warsaw Ghetto, and then ended up leading a small ensemble in Treblinka as well. In terms of the definition of Jewish music, now that is the question, isn't it? I've circled around a lot of definitions on this, and at the end of the day, I think that I don't know that there is any one definition that is going to work 100% of the time, because I think that the actual answer is less interesting than are the many different ways in which people identify it, right? And this is, again, me very much operating as a historian. I'm interested in the way that people create meaning, right, and define things for themselves. I'm using the term in this paper as a shortcut, essentially, for thinking about music that is, in one way or another, strongly related to, I guess I would say, like, in this case, Ashkenazic, East European, like, culture, religion, and sort of folklore, right? But even that is quite capacious and actually involves a great deal of borrowing and exchange with non-Jewish neighbors, right? Nothing is ever like 100% pure. In another area of my work, I'm actually working on how Yiddish-speaking Jews have tried to lay claim to Beethoven as kind of an honorary Jew. So this is a very capacious, fluid category for me. And in this paper, I am essentially using it as the term as a shortcut, fully knowing, like sort of mentally having an asterisk after it every single time. But yeah, thank you.
Jules, thank you so much for this paper. It's wonderful to hear it, especially after being able to read your abstract last summer and just to see how it has grown. I guess I am really like reflecting on that kind of sensorial aspect of Treblinka, and I want to just hear you maybe expand a little bit more on your comment when you mentioned like that isolated space and how that relates to the perpetrators. And I think it's really interesting, obviously, like Treblinka is an innocuous transit camp. And so for me, like the way that the music is operating here, the music's not for the SS. It is almost entirely for the Jews in this sense. So I would love to hear you expand upon, how that isolationism, what do you think really that plays into it? And then I'm just wondering, have you looked at any perpetrator accounts and if they've mentioned any reference to the use of music in the camp?
Yeah, I'll take the last part first. So I've been looking for that. There's not a lot. The perpetrators don't like to talk about it, right? For a variety of reasons, many of them probably legal. But it only sort of crops up here and there, and I haven't been able to find a lot on it, apart from sort of Franz Suchomel briefly talking about it in Shoah. If anyone does know references, I will happily take them. I'd love to dig into this more. Okay, let me try to review what you asked, because there were several questions. The sensory environment and the isolation, right? So I don't want to sort of overstate the case for Treblinka's isolation, because it obviously did have connections with the rest of the world, had to in order to function. And the SS there were able to periodically return to Germany for leave. But at the same time, it was and still is a relatively remote area, right? It's very hard to get to. You kind of have to, get a taxi or get a car or something. Like the train lines no longer run there. And you're just in the middle of a field. And it's actually a very, very beautiful place. Like, it's kind of idyllic until you realize that there are human bone fragments on the ground, right? And it's really shocking. I do think that actual location sort of informs a couple of different aspects of this. One is that, actually they're quite far from the centers of power, which means that they do have more freedom to do what they want. And I think that might be informing a little bit of, their choices. They sort of really do have the freedom to do whatever and make whatever decisions they want. Within limits, there are limits on that. And I think that might help us understand a little bit, the sort of the Germans' willingness to engage with this kind of music, right? I really do also think that they were bored. I think that they were really bored, and that part. Yes. Yeah, they're having these wild parties. They literally had a zoo. They captured bears and foxes and so forth from the forest and made a zoo. They had gardens. They had all these free time activities because they actually did not have work to do a lot of the time. And of course, the other things they did during this free time were horrendous. These were not good people. So I do think that the boredom plays a pretty big role, and maybe even there's a desire for a sort of creating a familiar soundscape, perhaps at work. I think when Szepicki talks about the schlagers, these like favorite pieces, and there's a moment in Ragotsky's testimony as well where he talks about how these two Ukrainian guards would come to him and the other musicians in Camp 2 and ask them to play Soviet songs that they knew from their childhoods, and they would like cry out of emotion and nostalgia, right? So I think there really is this sort of longing for something familiar that's going on. Did that actually answer your question? I know there were several parts there, but yeah. All right, thank you.
I think this was a good Q&A, and there is no end to it. I know that there are further questions, and we will move them to the break so that we can kind of stay on track for our next presentation. Jules, thank you very much. Our next paper has two presenters. Mélina, who's a concert pianist and a student in history, and she also teaches at the Conversatoire in Toulouse. She's not here with us today, but her part of the presentation is recorded. And with us we have today Emily Märker, who is an associate professor in history, and she is just across the Hudson River at Rutgers University. So welcome her and the presentation together with Mélina on the work of Leonhard Märker.
Thanks, everyone. So let me say, I'm really pleased to be here as an interloper, as someone that works not on music or sound or anti-Semitism. I am a French colonial historian by training, but I'm making a pivot and working on a personal family a project about reparations in transnational Europe today that has a point of departure, which is my personal family history of my paternal grandparents, who were both Holocaust survivors from Vienna. I knew that my grandfather was a composer, obviously. He passed away when I was 10 in the 90s. So I knew him. He played music in the house. I knew that he had been very successful before the war, and he was unable to recreate that success and relaunch his career in the US when he was here. I didn't realize until I started working on this project that actually it was the destruction of his career that anchored his sort of primary focus in trying to get reparations, in meaningful reparations for the destruction of his career, as opposed to all the other damage and destruction that he suffered. And so I was sort of poking around on the internet, looking at stuff related to the camps that he had been in, and discovered really haphazardly that there was an afterlife of his camp music that is actually really well known. So I'm going to talk about that more after I give the floor to a virtual Mélina, who will do some musicological analysis and present the work that she had been doing about Leo, my grandfather, unbeknownst to me, and she also didn't know that he had any heirs or anything. So it's a shame we're not here together, and we really wanted to co-present something, but I will now cede the floor to her virtually, and then I will come back and say a few concluding thoughts.
Leonhard Märker was one of more than 80 musicians interned in the camp of Gurs as undesirables, opponents of a Nazi regime, mostly German or Austrian, often Jewish, who had sought refuge in France as early as 1933. Wounded up in the spring of 1940 on French soil by the Third Republic, in an already anti-Semitic context, these foreigners, viewed as a potential fifth column, were interned in various French internment camps. In October 1940, Leonhard Märker was sent to the Gurs camp in southwest France, near the Spanish border at the foot of the Pyrenees, the largest internment camp in southern France, where 60,000 people were interned between 1939 and 1944. Among them were over 160 musicians from a wide variety of cultures and stylistic backgrounds. Art, and music in particular, played an essential role in the internees' survival behind the barbed wire at Gurs. In the context of an internment camp that was neither a labor camp nor an extermination camp. Artistic practices and productions were born of the free will of the internees, in contrast to the coerced performances at various camps in the East that were intended to torment or humiliate camp inmates. Faced with the horrors of daily life, hunger, cold, diseases, isolation, fear of death, art at Rutgers represented a form of spiritual resistance, a refuge, a space for transcendence, a means of being witness, an act of communion, creating a sense of belonging between internees sharing the same condition. The context of internment obviously had a strong influence on the compositions created behind the barbed wire, provoking ruptures in the creative processes, metamorphoses, linked to the psychological and physical difficulties of daily suffering, adapting to the material constraints that art is destined to overcome. Leonhard Märker, as an already well-known composer, naturally took his place in the artistic life of the camp. This is borne out by the scores he created, the musical sources that have come down to us in form of handwritten scores, Wird es Nacht im Camp de Gurs, Nightfall in Gurs Camp, November 1940, and The Lied from Gurs. The material trace of these sources, a few often simply monodic lines hastily scribbled on rare and precious paper, demonstrates the difficulty of overcoming the materialist constraints of internment. The texts of the songs have often been separated from the musical scores and have been passed on through the accounts of other internees, suggesting that these songs were sung spontaneously in the camp by non-musicians. The song, initially entitled In the Basses-Pyrénées, became the Lied from Gurs, Song of Gurs, a veritable camp anthem, testifying to the importance and popularity of Märker's songs for the Gurs internees. We see this in the writings of other internees, often non-musicians and simple listeners, who accounted the importance of the musical evenings and Märker's contribution as a musician, performer and composer. In this testimony by Rolf Weinstock, it is clear that the Lied von Gurs took a central role as a hymn, marking the identity of the camp's internees, and this music accompanied them through the deportation. The romanticized vision of the little boy singing the Lied von Gurs as a farewell song to the deportees symbolizes a last bastion of humanity from which they were torn. From a musicological point of view, musical analysis of Märker's composition dating from his internment reveals a stylistic change, reflecting the impact of the suffering of internment on compositional tonalities. The composer of operetta and light music finds a different, heavier and more tragic tone. Wird es Nacht im Camp de Gurs, composed in D minor. Das Lied von Gurs in A minor. The melodic lines are often descending, as evidenced by the subtitles Tango funèbre, funereal tango. As a sort of musical emblem of the camp, Märker's songs have naturally taken on an important role in the lecture concerts I give across Europe as a pianist and historian, with the aim of reviving the scores composed in the camps and particularly at Gurs. Märker's works have thus become a vehicle of transmitting the memory of the camp through music, witnesses to the camp's musical memory. My work as a pianist also involved harmonizing these songs which were often notated as a simple summary melody, and whose performance in the camp was depending on circumstances, certainly accompanied instrumentally by improvised harmonic support. This is confirmed by Hannah Meyer-Moses, who in her memoir Reise in die Vergangenheit, Journey into the Past, introduces the lyrics of the Song of Gurs with the following words. Then the composer of the Song of Gurs sang his composition accompanying himself on guitar. Indeed, musical instruments were present at the Gurs camp, sometimes brought by refugees from Spanish Civil War, from whom music was an essential part of their culture and life, or provided by relief organizations present at the camp. It is therefore possible that this Song of Gurs was accompanied by different instruments depending on the situation and the musicians present. Accordion, guitar, piano, small instrumental ensembles, etc. A certain absurdity of fate led to the fact that these camp scores, which due to the circumstances in which they were created are less accomplished and more modest compared to Märker's pre-war artistic output, Warum lügst du, Chérie, das Ministerium, are nonetheless the most frequently performed today. It is these melodies that keep Märker's memory alive as part of the musical memory of the Holocaust. This paradox questions my role as a performer from an ethical perspective. Is it legitimate to play these works again today in front of an audience? Is this what the composer would have wanted? Is it what the family wants today? Clearly, Märker did not compose these songs for posterity, to be performed before an audience in a concert hall. He composed them for the function they could have within the reality of the camp, so that their meaning of existence was intimately linked to the condition of the internees. In a way, these songs are the mouthpiece of the Gurs internees, expressing their anxiety, their fear of tomorrow. Sag, was wird aus dir und mir? The suffering of being isolated from the rest of the world. Da kommt nur der hinein, der kein Recht hat, auf der Welt zu sein. Far from their homeland, far from their loved ones. Wird's auch Nacht in ihren Seelen, weil ihnen die Lieben fehlen, die jetzt warten irgendwo. However, these songs also have a testimonial value, even if we perhaps interpret this value after the fact from our own contemporary perspective. The miracle of Märker's genius is that, even in the terrible circumstances of internment, he succeeded behind barbed wire in creating music perfectly adapted to the context and audience, the internees. With simple melodies scribbled on a piece of paper, he was able to capture the essence of the internee condition and make this Song of Gurs a real hit. Firstly, Märker chose the musical genre of tango, which had been particularly popular through Europe since the 1920s and was deeply ingrained in Yiddish culture. Many tangos were later composed and played in ghettos and concentration camps, for example, the tango of Auschwitz. Märker based his song on the rhythmic structure of a tango and called it tango chanson. The melody also shows the influence of the chanson française. The composition of a melody is particularly successful as it is a melody with recurrent intervals that is easy to remember. The success of this song also lies in the perfect match between the lyrics and the structure of the melody. Märker places the large intervals of seventh and sixth lips on the words trennt von der Welt ein Stacheldraht, separated from the word by barbed wire. With a kind of fermata on the climax of the text, Stacheldraht, barbed wire, before the second part of a chorus is repeated. Similarly, in the song Wird es Nacht in Camp de Gurs, Märker suspends the tempo of the tango with 4 fermatas placed on the words that reflect the crucial question asked by all the internees, which remain unanswered. Wann gehen wir frei? When will we be free? The recent discovery of this cassette, entitled Gurs Requiem, recorded by Märker towards the end of his life in 1989, lends legitimacy to giving voice to these songs today. The recording of this cassette shows that Märker wished to leave a testimony of his years of internment, and by preserving his music to save the memory of his fellow internees, the overwhelming majority of whom did not survive. Indeed, right up to the last days of his life, Märker carried with him the weight of those terrible years of internment, as well as the memory of his fellow prisoners, who were not as lucky as he was, and who left for the death camps, perhaps accompanied by his melodies. Curiously, in this recording, the lead von Gurs takes on a different form compared to the manuscript and written text. The lyrics are modified. A musical part introduces an excerpt from the Allegretto from Beethoven's 7th Symphony. Is this a version reconstructed by his memory almost 50 years after his internment at Gurs? Did he deliberately modify the text to give meaning to the deportation? You are only a number, no longer a man or a woman. Why did he include this Beethoven excerpt? Beethoven constructed this allegretto as an ostinato on the rhythm on a funeral march.
In den Pyrenäen gibt's einen Ort, wo Baracken nur stehen. Doch kein Baum steht dort. Dort muss nur der hinein, der kein Recht hat, Welt zu sein. Und wer den Ort betrat, entrennt von der Welt ein Stacheldraht in den Bass-Pyrenäen. So fängt es an, bist du nur eine Nummer, nicht Frau, nicht Mann, und gelingt dir ein Lächeln, trotz allem, was geschah, ahnst du im Herzen doch, das End ist nah. Mach schnell und rauf auf den Zug, marsch und frag nicht, wohin's geht. Wenn du allein fährst in Gurs, ist für das Beten zu spät in den Bauch.
What symbolism did Märker intend to convey? Beethoven certainly signifies a reference to a lost culture homeland, scorned by Nazism. Hence the dissonant bass lines in the piano, illustrating the distraction of order and harmony. Beethoven symbolizes classical musical culture in a Germanic or European context. Perhaps Märker wanted to illustrate musically a culture destroyed by barbarism, a symbol of his own life, battered and bruised by Nazism, of his music as a victim of antisemitism.
Okay, so yes, let's give her a round of applause. So I don't have a ton of time, but I'll say a few more things about Leo and this project. I mentioned that he was very successful prior to the war. These are programs for his, or posters for two of his biggest hits, which toured internationally in Central and Southeastern Europe in the 30s. I thought I was initially going to write about something else for this paper, so there's more on that in the abstract, and I can talk about that. But you know, these were the books, the musical books for the shows. He has them, and so you know, for me that, and these are also original programs and posters. Like he carried them with him in like his one suitcase that he had, that he brought to France when he fled after Kristallnacht, and that he was able to successfully bring to the US. You know, this was such an important understanding of his own self as a composer. You know, this was just the crux of his identity. And he was always haunted by that early success and that lost promise. And he really just was unable to relaunch that career in the States, as I mentioned. And so, you know, that phantom success is this thing that's looming over his career, or over the rest of his life. He was one of Alban Berg's students, and as a sort of testament to sort of how he had fallen from sort of prominence or being thought of among, you know, important composers from Vienna in the 30s, Adorno's book on Berg, which, you know, originally came out in German in '68, Leo's mentioned only once, and it's in a footnote. And that became especially poignant to me when, as I mentioned, I was sleuthing around on the internet, sort of looking for anything that I could find, and it turned out that the first German language monograph about art and music in Gers, the title before the colon is a lyric from that song, Das Lied von Gers. And so the sort of juxtaposition for me of this sort of complete overtaking of his musical legacy through his camp music, as opposed to the music that I know was so important to him, you know, that was really a sort of challenging, uncomfortable discovery in my internet sleuthing. And it became even more poignant to me when I discovered this traveling exhibition to commemorate the 80th deportation of southern German Jews to Gers, which was supposed to be sort of a touring exposition in 2020, the year of the pandemic, so it was obviously postponed. Gers is interesting and unusual in that it is one of the only concentration camps where German Jews were deported west. This was, you know, just a particular quirk of history. I meant to punish Vichy for something that they did that they didn't like, so they were like, here, we're going to take more of our Jews. Anyway, so this traveling exhibition came with a 2-hour promotional video, and this is, again, like a outlier in sort of French concentration camp commemorative culture, and it's because the German government is involved because of that deportation of German Jews to this camp. You know, there's just like a lot more investment and participation in co-managing the memory of that site, whereas, you know, there's no other German involvement in any of the other, you know, vast network of concentration camps in France. So I was just bopping around. I didn't have the patience to watch the whole 2-hour video, and I just randomly stumbled on, at the very end, a performance that Mélina had made as part of this exhibition in a reconstructed barracks at Gers, you know, with, you know, formal concert dress. This song that they perform is the other song that we didn't hear, Wer das Nacht in Camp de Gers, which I have the original sheet music for, so this was so curious to me. How is it that this woman, this Franco-German pianist in Europe, now is performing this music that I have here? And of course, there was this whole sort of network of transcribing music and passing it around among survivors. But, you know, the musical, you know, since we've started working together, she's now like changing the way that she interprets the music. And another piece, the other song, Das Lied von Gers, is another recording that she did is the music in the opening room of this online exhibit that isn't specifically about music in Gers, but just on Gers. And so I wanted to just play you a little bit about what Mélina's interpretation of the music sounds like, which has been like now completely upended by my discovery of this cassette tape of his own interpretation. But just so you can hear how it's been being performed for the past 5 years. Oops. Okay, hold on. This is the same song that we heard the excerpt from. So obviously now, Mélina and I have a bit of a conundrum about what to do. She's gone and sort of, worked with a composer to fill out the musical accompaniment and do this arrangement, and it's beautiful music. It's concert hall music, and what he wrote is not concert hall music, quite patently. So the conclusion here is that, all of that discomfort that I was feeling about this sort of overtaking or swamping of his musical legacy with his concentration camp music versus his glitzy triumphs on the Viennese stage has been now completely exploded by the discovery of this tape, part of which you've heard, and I will give him a little bit more airtime, if I may, with a song, an excerpt from a song that we don't have any sheet music for. No one else has referred to it in the literature. He says on the tape that it was written in Gers in 1942. He actually was not in Gers anymore in 1942. He was in a different concentration camp outside of Marseille. But the sound of the song is really wild, and because you all are sound studies experts and musical experts, I want you to hear it so you can tell me what you think about it. And then he has some narration about what the tape and these songs mean to him and how he wants them to be remembered. And so we'll end it there. So let's see, make this work. Okay.
Wie gezongen, zo verklongen, toch niemals vergessen. Requiem for the victims of the French concentration and death camps of Count de Gers and carnival is not conceived in the traditional sense of that art form in music, but rather symbolically as an act of remembrance, any remembrance of the dead. Here, remembering the thousands and thousands of camp victims of Gurs and Lemil, by conjuring up the memory of their lager leader, camp songs. They all loved and cared so much to sing in the running out time of their short existence. Songs that were written by a fellow inmate, expressing their fears, hopes, and final despair more vividly and hauntingly than any book could ever reveal.
I'm gonna just stop it there. And I will actually not give him the last word. I will say one last thing. No, I will. I will stop it there. Thank you.
So questions or comments for Emily? Matthias, you are sitting all the way up there. Give me a second. No, you need to speak into the microphone.
Yeah, thank you so much for this presentation. It's really breathtaking, I would say. Especially, I would be very interested in a little bit more details about this tape, as I'm doing research a lot about media also, and also the media history of migration, of exile. So you said that this tape like popped out for you as a surprise. So in your family, it was not known that it was existent. So do I understand it right? He was telling this story and he was singing to the machine.
Yeah.
Because he couldn't do it maybe to a human person, or how no one knew about it, or how do I have to imagine that?
Yeah, exactly. Nobody knew about the existence of this tape. I had been working on this project for 2 years before we found the shoebox, going through, my grandparents' archive with tapes. I haven't listened to them all even. In 1989, he was almost 80. I was alive. I could have been over there that morning. Who knows? I spent a lot of time with my grandparents when I was a kid. My grandmother could not have known that it existed. If she had, she certainly would have shared it with us. So the image of him in his apartment up in Morningside Heights, alone, like taking a moment when she was out doing the shopping or whatever, and playing this on their old, crummy, out-of-tune piano is really, really bleak. Otherwise, what I can say about the actual tape, which, this is it, this is what I have. One of the songs that is on the tape, well, I shouldn't say, there are 2 tapes. One is called Prior and what is called Latest. So he was re-recording this music and spending a lot of time, and on the different tapes you can hear overlaid excerpt, like where he is reusing the same tape to record. And this is like a handheld tape recorder, right? Not any kind of fancy musical equipment. But one of the songs, which I didn't put on this PowerPoint presentation, but I can share with you sometime, maybe you can analyze the quality of the timbre of the music and explain it to me. He says that actually one of these songs that's on this tape, he recorded with some friends after the war. And the sound quality is very different. Presumably it was pressed. I mean, I don't know. We haven't gone through all of his records yet either. So, he has this massive collection of 78s. And yeah, so we'll see. We'll see what else I find. But that seems to be what I can say in answer to that question for right now. Thanks. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you so much. This is such fascinating work, and I have so many thoughts, but I'll try and just keep it to 2. But one, I think presenting the singing in the concert hall, that really reminds me of like Patricia Hall, a music theorist work, when she found some music in Auschwitz that had never been performed before, and at University of Michigan, and they performed it. And I think there's just this larger question of the ethics of the space at Auschwitz is obviously so much different than like performing in a concert hall, and that's exactly what you were getting at there. And then when you're presenting this tape, for me, I'm very much just, it's viewing it as a sense of testimony, and I guess I'm just larger, did your grandfather ever, was he recorded by like USC Shoah Foundation or anything? It's just like, these are his testimonials.
This is his testimony.
Yeah.
There is
Okay.
no other testimony from him with regard to like his experience in the war, other than like he has a file of, you know, the way that he was ultimately released in these French concentration camps is complicated. His father was on some multinational corporate boards, and like these people that, you know, were vague business associates of his father, who was still, you know, who left Vienna for Lviv after Anschluss, and they did not survive. But he was corresponding with these colleagues, and they got my grandfather out in June 42, so like just before all of the deportations. And he has some like annotations in the correspondence between those people, and that's it. So like it's really sort of the way he put together the papers and the marginalia and the tape. That's his testimony.
It's really, because like just listening to the difference in his tone of voice, like I've listened to so much testimony, and I think when you're listening to the sound, I think he's really recalling exactly how it was in the camp, which I think is amazing. And this work is great, so thank you so much for your paper.
Thank you so much. This is extraordinary. What an interesting story, and really meaningful, and I can imagine very personal for you. And that's a little bit about what I'd like to ask. I mean, I think that many of us in this room, I certainly was struck, as you were, by the gap, or the kind of discomfort of seeing this piece, a beautiful kind of cabaret-style piece, performed in this very stark barracks. And it's not even like, if she were wearing just a plain black shirt, I'd be like even a little more comfortable. Yeah. But the sort of the jewels and the lace and everything, it seems so decadent, which is what we associate with that sound of the cabaret. So I'm really struck and very uncomfortable with it on one hand, and the other, I wonder, you know, for kind of scholarship in general, there's a lot that's been written about other repertoires that have been sort of displaced from origins of oppression, and I think about, you know, spirituals from the African American community, and the way that they have been kind of recast, reinterpreted. They've been concertized, right? They've been rendered suitable for concerts, sanitized in a way. So things that started as songs of work and oppression have become things that we hear in Carnegie Hall, and it's weird. And uncomfortable, and you know, the ethics are complicated, but also something that, you know, many descendants of enslaved people feel is right, because at least it's perpetuating the sound and the musical agency, which is something that was touched on earlier. I guess just from, I'm interested, all this is a prelude to the question, which is how do you see your position as a scholar and a relative, right? And this is your family heritage, and how do you kind of separate, or do you not separate, your different roles in this very extraordinary and complicated story?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the Negro spirituals being concertized comparison analogy. That's great. I'm gonna look into that literature, especially because actually what this project is about you know, I am very present in the project, because the project really, the music has been kind of a shockingly compelling detour and like sidebar to the thing that I was actually working on, and now I'm like in it. And that's why I'm here, to learn from all of you, and I really appreciate this opportunity. But really what I'm doing with the original idea of the project was, you know, when my grandmother passed away in 2018, I inherited a shocking sum to me, because I had always thought of my grandparents as quite poor. And she actually had been collecting an Austrian pension that was like part of reparations, belated reparations, and then in 2019, Austria opened up citizenship to descendants. So I'm going through that process, but I'm a post-colonial scholar, right? So, for me, that's actually pretty awkward to be implicated in the selectiveness of Europe's transnational reparations regime. And so I'm leaning into that positionality as both a descendant and beneficiary and a post-colonial scholar to sort of, I guess, using sort of like a implicated subject kind of frame, but maybe not, I don't really know, but just trying to like really lean into that and think about intergenerational transfers of wealth and belonging, or intergenerational transfers of debt and non-belonging, right? I mean, there are, in my first book, which is about decolonization in Francophone Africa, a lot of those people were citizens in the late colonial period because the empire was trying to democratize in order to like hold on to its legitimacy in the post-war era. And those people have never been offered like the descendants of those people have never been offered reparative citizenship, right? So I am very present, and now with the music, I'm like differently present. I mean, this is the first time I've played the tape for an audience, and we are my dad and I, who I'm working really closely with on this project, obviously, we're constantly negotiating like what we want to share, if we want to actually donate the tape or not, so that it lives somewhere. The idea of people recording it or using it for their own purposes is very uncomfortable. We're working with the copyright librarian at Rutgers has been advising us about how to protect the intellectual property. I find it all really overwhelming. My dad and I actually went to a commemoration that Mélina got us invited to at GERS in the fall, where she performed with a friend of hers, a Basque tenor, and we spent the weekend with them. And I mean, that commemoration for my dad and I was pretty awkward. We felt very uncomfortable there. None of the German dignitaries that were there like actually wanted to talk to us, even though we had to be like presented to them in this very formal way of like, thank you so much for including us. And then when the music was performed, like that was interesting. It was different, right? Like they weren't dressed like this. We were like in a big mess hall in the little village where GERS is, and there were, hundreds of German high school and university students and all of these, representatives of the southern, the Baden Jewish community now, and then like the dignitaries of the Lande, whatever, that were implicated in this. And so I'm very much in the story, and I'm a historian, and that's to this question before about, what does it all mean today? Like, I mean, it is a very different process of doing research where like I'm going on trips with my dad, and we're going to concerts as part of the work. I did a very sort of classic political history for my first book. I was just in archives by myself, and now I have collaborators out the wazoo because everybody. It's a personal family history, which is, a move right now in historical studies. People talk about the personal turn. It's not coming out of nowhere or like, even that methodologically radical anymore. But yeah, I'm figuring it out. And as it is, I mean, I've given, quite foolishly, I had kind of said at some point that my dad could kind of vet whatever I'm writing before I publish it. And that is a nightmare now because, as you can imagine, I published something in 2024, a very short little piece that was about the article that I talk about in the abstract, which is this, which was sort of 1939 German language Paris Daily that was calling out the hypocrisy of this like fight against Jewish music. Even though they were performing one of my grandfather's shows in Berlin, like at this moment, under a false name. Like it had already been expropriated and Aryanized in Vienna, and that publishing house like passed it on, and it was on stages, apparently. Like I still have to verify all of this, but there's a couple of other references to it, so I think it's correct. Anyway, so when I wrote this little piece, there was language in there like shame and humiliation, and it was like red pen. And so I don't really know, from my dad, so I don't really know how it's all gonna come together, but I mean, it is gonna, whatever it is, it's gonna be something public facing. It's not gonna be like a scholarly monograph, so hopefully there's space to lean into all of that. complexity.
Thank you so much for your really fascinating presentation. I know that there are more questions, but we have now a coffee break, so this is a space where we can continue our conversations with our two presenters. Please give them both a hand, and let's move to the coffee.